One of the things that we've been talking about lately on the show is this idea that national headlines are national headlines, right? Like they have flaws, right? Like number one, when you cast a very, very wide net, you're not speaking very specifically into a market or a specific dynamic. It's not something that investors, while they can keep their ear to the grindstone, national headlines aren't generally going to move the needle for you. But even worse, we're living in a world where the media system is incentivized by clicks, right? So kind of like when we went into the system of saying extra, extra, hear all about this, and people were selling single papers, we're doing that, right? So there's this dynamic when you are a investor and you're trying to build a portfolio that is going to serve you in retirement. There is things that are not in your favor when it comes to guiding yourselves by national headlines. And you've identified a couple of these, right? The first one is this idea that spiking mortgage rates have already pushed the housing market into a housing correction. That was, published by Fortune magazine, saying that we're in a full-blown housing correction and we'll soon see year-over-year rate of home price appreciation fall from a record 20.6% to 0%. What do you think of that? What's the problem with that headline?
I think the problem is that there's not a standard for when we use certain terms, first of all, but we tend to throw, or the national headlines tend to throw them around like they are a standard across all asset classes. And if you start to use the same terminology around all asset classes, you paint a very different picture than what reality is. And so they use many terms very loosely. Even when they do pay attention to actual data, they use those terms very loosely. Like the first thing for me, when you just heard housing correction there, Pablo, what does that make you think?
It makes me think of a stock market correction, right? Like that's where that language comes from for me.
Yeah, exactly. So a stock market correction is known to be a drop between maybe 10% from the high up to 20%, or I guess down to 20% from a recent high. That's what we would call a stock market correction. So when you hear a headline that says there's a housing market correction, Pablo, what type of drop are you expecting?
I'm assuming a 10 to 15% kind of like haircut on the value of the property that I own.
Yeah. You want to know something interesting? I don't know if I've ever shared this on the show, but it just struck me. Do you know, even during the Great Recession, we never had a housing drop of 10% year over year in Jacksonville.
Interesting. What was the total market drop during the Great Recession?
It was about 35% in Jacksonville over a 3-4 year span.
And it was never more than 10%?
Never more than 10%. We never technically had a housing correction, if you use the same terminology across all these different asset classes, in the Great Recession. So, and then if you actually read that article that I shared with you, I think it was from Fortune, right?
Fortune. Yeah. It was Moody's Analytics on Fortune.
Yeah. And so they quoted, these are very respected publications, right? So then you actually read that article a little bit more, and it quotes the chief economist of Moody's, and who had said, hey, we're here for a full-blown housing correction. If we are standardizing what correction means, right, you would expect 10 to 20%. What do you think a full-blown housing correction is? That's probably closer to 20% loss, right? So these terms are used very loosely, thrown around, and they create a lot of hysteria. And you're right, they generate a lot of clicks. It's not very sensational. It doesn't drive a lot of revenue for you or me or anybody else to get on a platform and say, you know what? I think that housing is going to cool, and I think it's going to level it out, and I think we're going to get back to basics, and I think people are still going to invest the same way they always should have been investing in rental properties. Like, that's not going to drive any clicks. Reading that article a little bit more, though, what I did think was really, really interesting and a miss on the chief economist who was quoted here, in the exact same sense where he says we're going to see a full-blown correction, he goes on to say we are going to see home prices, in his estimation, flatten out to 0% growth over the next year. How full-blown housing correction, in the same sense, he defines that as 0% growth, right? Very different. And I don't have too many examples in the same sentence where it's like speaking out of both sides of your mouth like I do on that one. But for that one, you can clearly see that the people who are writing the headlines for the articles are very different from the folks that are actually creating the data or providing the data. And even those folks sometimes are talking out of both sides of their mouth.
Yeah. If I were to go devil's advocate, if what this dude believes is going to happen nationally is going to happen, and play with me here on this one, but if it's going to go from like, if we are nationally growing at 20% to 0, it is a delta of minus 20%, which does go with kind of like correction language. What do you think of that?
If the stock market was up 20% earlier in the year, and then you expect the stock market over the next year to be flat, would you say that that's a stock market correction?
No.
Why do we say that about housing?
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's a double standard out there. And it just,
Yeah.
it plays into the fears too. I mean, listen, a lot of us are, especially in our community here, we're affected by the Great Recession, either with our primary residences or rental properties or other real estate that we had. I mean, we still have a very sore spot for what real estate caused in terms of recession that was unprecedented. And so, you know, we have now since then seen real estate go up at higher than normal rates for a long time. And there's a reason for that, because we crashed so hard during the Great Recession that they are going to go up. But there's this, we kind of feel it. Like if you just let emotions guide you here, you should say, oh, geez, it's been 10 plus years of real estate doing really well. All right, we got to have a correction. We got to have a crash. We just have to. But when you look at actual data, when you look at supply and demand, it tells you a very different story. And the risk here is if you go on emotions and you go on the headlines and you go on what the talking heads are saying because they're incentivized to give you the most sensational story, you're going to make bad decisions with your money. And so that is a mission of the show, is to get rid of this double standard when it comes to other asset classes. And I think a big part of that is the language that we use across other asset classes. So I think we're going to have a lot of examples as we go forward for the next, call it 3 to 6 months. We're going to get a lot of examples. Everybody on the show should be very, very prepared to see a lot of very negative headlines on the real estate market is going to happen. There's going to be some truths in those. When we talk about the number of home sales going down, I fully expect that. When we talk about the number of inventory, the amount of houses on the market going up, I fully expect that. But what we have to keep in perspective is that the place that we were at was unprecedented as far as the ratio of sales and inventory. It was so low for that months of inventory number. We have never, ever seen it like that. We were under 1 month of inventory. And so for those who watch the show, or maybe this is your first time, a normal equilibrium market is between 6 to 7 months of inventory. The reason we say that is because if you look over time, when you have 6 to 7 months of inventory, you normally see normal home price appreciation in your market, which in Jacksonville is 4.6% appreciation each year. So that's saying that we would need to have 6 to 7 times the amount of inventory per sales in Jacksonville just to get to normal. So as it starts to creep up, right, we are still way below the normal equilibrium of what a market should be. And that is the perspective that we need to have as we go into this time where sales are going to normalize. Inventory levels are going to normalize. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing for the market. It really is.
What I'm hearing in your language is it may help us to think of this as a housing market normalization as opposed to a correction. And if I think through that, as opposed to just kicking it back to you, I think of the idea of correction being this like negative, punishing thing, while a normalization means, oh, okay, then that means I can just keep operating according to the rules that have always been set, and I'm going to be fine, as opposed to I need to change all the rules.
Yeah, exactly. Normalization is a much more accurate depiction of what has to happen, what I truly want to happen. I don't want values to keep going up 20%. Because that has negative ramifications all over the board, right? I personally own a lot of real estate here, and there's a lot of clients that are on the call here, right? Like we all should be very, very happy with a normalized market, right? A normal market in Jacksonville goes up about 4.6% each year.